welcome back to the table. Today we have Andromeda's Edge set up for you. This is a game that I am personally very excited about. This comes from Luke Laurie, who is one of our favorite, I would say our favorite designers.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And it's kind of the follow-up, spiritual successor, sequel, whatever you want to call it, to Dwellings of Eldervale, which came out a few years ago and was massively popular. This does share, I think, a lot of the same DNA with that game, but has evolved as well.
Yeah, I think, like a lot of Luke's games, you see a lot of DNA. But like Ryan said, I think if you're familiar with Dwellings of Eldervale, you are going to be right at home with this. And if you like the sci-fi theme, even better. The other thing is, there's a lot of the elements of that game that they've taken and enhanced. And not just one element, but everything you can think of from some of his past games, but particularly that one, you can see tweaks that I think we think are probably for the better. At least they're more. They're more to think about. They're more to do. Yeah. A little bit more satisfying than just firing off your cards, but maybe firing them off in certain orders or having the cards organized. We'll get to all of this in a second.
Yeah, this does have that, like what I would call at this point, classic Luke Laurie loop, where you're either placing workers out on the board or pulling workers back to your player board to trigger things off. Thematically, you are at Andromeda's Edge, the edge of the galaxy, and you have a space station that kind of starts the game very limited. You have this basic space station with some modules of different colors here, and this is where you're going to store all your resources, it's where you're going to store your ships, and it's where you're going to store your modules, which is kind of a key thing to this game, that concept of going out to Andromeda's Edge, visiting these locations in order to build out the modules on your space station, and then when you bring your workers back, triggering all those modules on your space station to get more resources, more points, more different elements of the game. I like that a lot. I like that you're kind of building out a variable space station with different kind of powers that other players don't have. Plus, everyone is playing a faction as well, which is going to give you access to some special powers, some starting resources,
unique
some starting
ships.
Tracks, unique ships that you can upgrade into, which I think is really neat. So there's just a lot of ways to kind of build your own sandboxy player board here.
Yeah, for sure. And like Ryan said, this is one of those structures where you're either placing out or you're calling back. When you place out, in this case, there's going to be a variable board set up here that has bases and planets or moons. I think there may be planets.
Yeah, well, you visit the planet and you get to harvest from the moon effectively.
Yeah, so you're going to be taking the moons from the planets, and these are effectively the resources. This one has one of the resources, actually two.
Titanium and energy.
And
that's
with those,
pretty juicy.
That is a juicy one. When you take those, you can either just use them at any time. You can only store 4 of them, but you can use them just to take those resources, or like some of his other games, you can slot those in different aspects of your board. There's one place on your board. A lot of the modules are going to require these. You might put one in to use it as a transaction to pay that to get something else, or to pay something else to get whatever you put on the moon, which is a really fun, again, that variable idea of what you're building up here is significant.
Yeah, now, like a lot of his games, like Dwellings, there's I would call a very, almost like a puzzle element to this game, and as far as when you're placing. If you're placing your first ship out, it can go anywhere that's unoccupied. Every other ship you're placing has to go within range of that, and each one of your different ships is going to have different ranges that let it bounce around the board, as well as some different powers. We had mentioned that those ships can get upgraded, which is nice. You're going to have one special upgrade for your faction, and you're going to be dealt a number of generic upgrades that anybody could get. And you're going to be able to gain better versions of each one of your ships, which are effectively workers, that give you more powers, that let you do different things on the board. But effectively, you're just coming out here trying to either harvest resources from these moons or take the actions of the Alliance bases that were left behind. These actions are going to let you, build more ships, draw some cards, get some credits or some money, and build the modules that go onto your space station, which I think is kind of the central goal, is to build those modules so that you can trigger more things as you pull your workers back.
For sure. Those bases are very familiar, but a couple of them, like Ryan said, are going to let you interact with this up here. You're going to be able to take a couple of either green or brown modules or a yellow or blue module. You take one or two, and when you take those, it's going to let you go up on these tracks, which we'll get to in a minute. But the modules themselves come back to the side of your player board. And unlike his other games where you just kind of collect a tableau of cards, you build them out specifically in columns along the side of your player board. And when you fire them off, this is the biggest difference. You're not just firing them off with the workers you bring back, or the ships in this case, but also energy, which is one of the resources. So as long as you've fired off one of the modules in, say, the top row or the second row, you can then fire off any other module in that same row using energy instead. So what this does is it allows you to make an already satisfying aspect of his games even more satisfying, because you're firing off potentially a ton more, because you can store up quite a bit of energy and then just do a ton over here. Not to mention there are combos, because this top row often has actions that give you energy. And you can use that to get more energy, and then you just keep things going. And these modules also let you do a lot of the same things that you'd expect to do out on the board as well.
Yeah, and they're cool little mini games almost, in that each one of these modules kind of fires off in a different way. So your reactor, as soon as you fire it, you get to fire off every green card that's in your reactor. You can choose to focus up a big, huge green reactor. Your shipwright ability lets you stack those brown cards and then slot moons in between them. So if you activate both cards on either side, you're getting the moon bonus as well. And some of these can be pretty juicy moon bonuses. You have the treasury, which is going to give you a ton of credits, which is wild resources. And then your blue architect, which can contain a lot of in-game scoring cards that aren't necessarily triggered, but that are going to give you points at the end of the game. So each one of these 4 rows functions very differently, gives you very different synergies, and you kind of have to decide if you're going to focus on building one out really well, or if you're going to kind of mix and match as you play.
Yeah, and Ryan mentioned that blue row, one of the actions is just like an action out on the board, which is lets you put what effectively you might think of as a settlement out on one of the planets. And in this game, it's quite a bit different. It's not just a worker with a roof on his head. This one has these really amazing miniatures. And there's an extra layer to this because there are leaders in this game found out here on the hexes.
Yeah, and you have to kind of rescue these leaders as you play the game. As you go to these locations that have leaders, you can recruit them back to your player board, but you're later going to have to spend them. Anytime you want to build these developments, and this is another key thing that is probably core to scoring points in this game. As you're playing and building these developments, you're going to gain cards that kind of show you what that development does. So we're not just building these generic settlements. We're actually building specific developments with specific powers that will score you points at the end of the game. Each planet has a color. Each one of those colors links to a different track. The higher you are on the track, the more points you're going to get for that particular development. But like David said, you have to be collecting resources and you have to be collecting leaders in order to build these developments. And this is maybe one of my favorite things about the game.
Yeah, you've got to build it for them right now.
You slot your leaders into that development and then you actually place it out onto your colored base, effectively losing a ship, but gaining a lot of points for doing so. And also just building out this cool looking figure out on the board.
Yeah, it is an incredibly cool looking figure. Plus, one of the big elements here is those leaders are going to score significantly if they're around this thing right now, which is a big difference between this and Eldervale. Because in Eldervale, the scoring really ramped so much so that the beginning of the game felt maybe a little light.
You're right.
Whereas this one, there's scoring opportunities early on when you look at those leaders out there, because you're going to score points for all of the leaders from players in the game around the settlement you just built. But as the game gets played, these leaders are going to be pulled off the board. So in a weird way, it starts to balance because there's leaders now out on the board in other developments, but there's fewer leaders out on the board just kind of waiting to be recruited.
Yeah, and that is kind of a tension in the game with other players because you're wanting to get out there and get your leaders as fast as possible. But again, there's that puzzle element. You're limited by how far you can move, and maybe some of these leaders are out on actions you don't necessarily want to take or can't afford to take at the time, so you can't get them. But the faster you can rescue your leaders, the more developments you can build earlier in the game. Developments give you other bonuses. Like I said, they give you one-time abilities. They give you bonuses to combat because, yes, of course, there is combat in this game. But you're kind of wanting, again, to kind of pair up the color of developments you're building or the color planets you're on to the different tracks you're going up. You're going up these tracks by buying modules. So you'll see how these elements all start to link together. If you're building a lot of yellow developments, you want to get a lot of yellow cards to move up that yellow track. And there's one track in the center, the combat track, which you can only go up by starting fights with other players, which is kind of the conflict that's in this game.
Yeah, the combat is also quite similar. It is dice-based, and you're looking at whoever has that highest die. And in this one, you're actually going to be able to use energy to sort of enhance your situation there. But just like his other games, the combat in this game is not one to be sort of afraid of or shy away from. If you don't like aggressive combat games, don't think, oh, there's combat, I'm out.
Sure.
Because this combat, to me, feels like it's presented more like an opportunity in gameplay as opposed to, oh, this guy's a warmonger and everyone's just staying away from them.
Yeah.
Because you have these cards that are going to give you bonuses. There's a space here even on your board. When you lose combat, you can actually get a card, so it kind of will help you maybe in the next combat. Plus, you can slot a moon here, so you might even strategically jump into someone's combat because you can do that when it's not even your turn. If you're adjacent to a combat, you can go, I'll send a ship in there. Sacrifice the ship temporarily in order to, maybe get the resources you need for when your turn comes around.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to get into combat in this game. One of them being the combat track, the other being all these different tactics cards, which can give you benefits for losing, or it can kind of give you some kind of other benefit that you just need to be in combat to trigger these cards.
Yeah.
These tactics cards are really cool, but they do encourage you to get in fights. Now, unlike Dwellings, when you lose people to what they call the scrapyard, it's not as big of a deal. Normally, you're like, okay, I can't use that ship now to trigger one of my modules, but since you can use energy instead, it's not as punishing. So it definitely wants to encourage you to get into combat. Of course, you don't have to. You can kind of wait and see and watch for other players, see how many ships they have left. You can kind of determine when they might pull back, because when they pull back, then they're freeing some locations that you can go to without starting combat. Of course, these raiders, which are like the NPC bosses, are going to trigger combat whenever you move near them. So you can't really avoid
Not necessarily.
You can try to,
but
it's tough to do that.
And like Ryan said, that's what this middle track's all about. But one thing that's common to all the tracks, and Ryan mentioned there's events in that deck, there's also events in the game.
Yeah.
There's this whole events board, and you'll trigger that by hitting a lot of these icons here, and there's even some of those icons on some of the bases as well. This adds an interesting little flavor to the game because it's player controlled. So as you go up and hit these, it's going to go up this track. And once it hits the top of the track, you flip over the event and you resolve it. Some of these are really just kind of, again, more opportunities that you can have to score. There might be a situation where this event's out, and while it's out, okay, this is the situation. So we all have to take it into consideration as we play our next round until maybe the next event is flipped over.
Yeah, each one of these events gives you a scoring opportunity, scoring for going up certain tracks or having certain modules or having certain resources or ships, whatever. There's always a different scoring element. There's always a new raider added, and we have a deck of raider cards here. When you play this game, you're going to get to use a raider of every letter. You're going to kind of get to mix and match from all the different amounts of content that they have to create your unique deck of raiders. And like David said, that element of some bonus that you're getting, like maybe a free ship or a cheaper upgrade. But you're also adding tiles to the board every time you trigger that event as well. So that's how you're exploring out this area. You're not going to a specific location to reveal tiles. If you want these tiles to come out, you need to find ways to push the events forward so that those events trigger.
Yeah, and this game is not triggered by that tile stack running out. This game is triggered by scoring a certain amount of points.
Yeah, and you can set that amount of points.
It can be variable. You can say, let's play to 50
long,
or a little longer or something like that. But once that's done, you're going to basically add up all your points. You're going to get those points from a lot of places.
Yeah, there are a ton of different ways you're scoring points. The most significant is you're multiplying your developments, or you're getting points for your developments based on how far you went up those tracks. But also, some of those cards are going to give you in-game scoring. Some of the modules that you built out into your space station are going to give you in-game scoring. So you're getting scoring from a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different strategies. Like I said earlier, that idea of just focusing completely on one track, getting to the top and building a lot of developments.
That's what I do all the time.
But you can get a lot of points just by going halfway up the tracks and getting a bunch of different colors and kind of being a jack of all trades. So there's a lot of different ways you can score points during the game and at the end of the game. Again, I like that. It almost feels like that point salad where you're just getting points from all these different places.
For sure. So that is Andromeda's Edge from Cardboard Alchemy and Luke Laurie. If you have any questions at all about this, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and try to answer what we can. Until next time, of course, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.